Chapter 10, Year 4, Part 4. Awareness returned gradually. First came the knowledge that he was. He did not know where or who he was, but he knew he existed. He looked around in vague curiosity. There was an endless sea of white on all sides of him, but it seemed to be changing form the longer he looked at it, swirling clouds, solidifying into shapes. Just as a glimmer of understanding began to dawn, these archways, this domed ceiling, these columns, they were somehow familiar. He heard a voice calling out from behind him. "Harry!" Knowledge rammed into him before he'd finished turning. A little dizzy, he stared at two figures emerging from the mist. "Mum?" They came closer still. "Dad?" They smiled at him, the way they'd done a long time ago in the Mirror of Erised, and Harry swallowed past an obstruction in his throat. "I'm dead," he stated, more to himself than to them. Harry's father, tall, with messy hair and slightly foggy glasses, reached him in 2 steps. Harry found himself engulfed in an embrace, his face pressed to his dad's robes. "Not quite," James Potter said softly. "Not yet." Once he released Harry, Harry's mum stepped forward. Harry saw now that she held a bundle in her arms. She handed it to James with a stern look, and he took it, grimacing. "Oh, Harry," Lily said as she swept him into a hug. "I love you," she whispered into his ear, and her hair, a deep, warm red, tickled Harry's nose. She smelled like something long forgotten, like fresh dough and safety. Harry nodded wordlessly into her shoulder, trying to rein in the tears gathered in his eyes. "Let's sit," Harry's mum said, wiping the dampness off her own cheeks, and drew Harry towards a row of benches he had not noticed before. She turned to James as they walked. "Let me take it back," she said, and withdrew the bundle from her husband's awkward hold. "What is it?" Harry inquired. Lily and James Potter exchanged glances. Then, without speaking, Lily lowered her arms. Harry reeled back in shock and bumped into his dad, who steadied him by the shoulder. "This is—" It was the horrible misshapen baby with flaky pigmented skin that Harry had seen Voldemort be before the rebirth ritual. Except that now the baby was sleeping, a pained expression on its scrunched-up face. Harry swallowed against his nausea. "Why are you holding it?" he asked his mother, and was proud of the way his voice lacked hysterical notes. "It's only a baby," she replied sadly. "I could not listen to it cry." They sat down on a bench, Harry's parents on either side of him. Harry kept stealing glances at the baby in his mother's arms. It unnerved him to see it so close to her. "You didn't tell me what it was," he said hesitantly. "Why is it here?" James sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I think it's best if we start at the beginning," he uttered. "And when is that?" There was a pause. "The night we died," Lily said softly, not looking at Harry. "No," James countered. "The night Trelawney gave the prophecy." Harry listened, with mounting anxiety, as his parents narrated the tale of their own deaths and the events leading up to it, the batty divination professor, then only a candidate for the post, giving a prophecy that would seal Harry's future, the attack on Halloween, the protective power of Lily's sacrifice. Harry had known from memories unearthed by the Dementors what happened that night. He'd heard his mother's screams, his father's last words, Voldemort's high-pitched laugh. But he'd never imagined, even in his darkest nightmares, that he was the cause of it all. "I'm sorry," he whispered, staring unseeingly into the distance. "He came for me. If not for me, you'd still be—" "Don't say that," Lily implored, touching the back of Harry's hand to make him look at her. "Please, don't say that. If I had that choice today, I'd have done it again. I'd have taken the curse for you, today, just as then. It is not your fault. Only Voldemort is to blame. I would always make the same choice."
"As would I," James added firmly.
"Yes, but if not for me—"
"If not for Voldemort," James corrected. "And if not for Voldemort, things would have been different altogether."
Harry closed his eyes for several long moments, trying to calm his breathing. Neither Lily nor James spoke, evidently giving him time. When Harry opened his eyes, it was to check that his parents were still there. "What did the prophecy say?" he asked finally. Lily was the one to recite the words. They came out almost soothing, like a lullaby, only a twisted one promising death and pain before a hope of peaceful sleep. "The power to vanquish the Dark Lord as equal, and either must die and neither can live." "I've just died," Harry said. "The prophecy is fulfilled." James and Lily remained silent. Harry bit his lip.
"Isn't it?"
"It got complicated," James pronounced, brown eye serious, "because of Lily's sacrifice."
"I don't understand," Harry said.
The bundle in his mother's arms gave a soft mew. Harry jumped and threw it a disgusted look. James frowned.
"Do you want me to take it?" he asked Lily.
"It's just a baby," she repeated. "It's okay." James shook his head, as if to jiggle his thoughts into a coherent arrangement.
"Look, Harry, this is not the sort of magic you're used to, not the sort of swish-flick-whoosh instant effect established procedure stuff. It's deeper magic, soul magic, where things get murky and nobody can really predict anything. It's difficult to understand."
"But you do," Harry said.
"I'm dead," James explained. "That helps." Lily hit James on the arm, reaching from behind Harry.
"Concentrate," she said. "We don't have much time."
"We don't?" Harry asked, alarmed. "Depends which way you look at it," James said. "In earthly terms, we have no time at all. Now, when Lily died the way she did, she invoked deep, ancient magic. She gave you protection the likes of which nothing measures up to."
"And this is why Voldemort could not kill me?" Harry ascertained. "That is debatable," Lily said, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "There's also the prophecy to think of, which promised that he would mark you as his equal. There were many forces at work here, and—" Lily threw a glance at James. James looked at his shoes.
"Harry, this may be difficult to hear," he told them. "None of this is something anyone chose to let happen, but—"
"When Voldemort tried to kill you that night," Lily continued, forcing the last few words through with visible effort, "when the killing curse rebounded on him, a piece of his soul, it broke off. It sought the nearest living being to occupy, and—" Lily clasped her hands and finished in a hushed voice. "It happened to be you." Harry experienced a brief feeling of vertigo, like he was falling down very far and very fast. He looked from his mum to his dad, hoping to see that he'd misunderstood something, that his mother hadn't just said what he thought she'd said. But they were both solemn, unsmiling, serious. "All this time, I've lived with Voldemort's soul inside mine?" he asked, very calmly.
Not inside," James hurried to explain, seeing the look on Harry's face. "They did not mesh. It was in you, but it interacted with your soul very little. Your parcel-tongue abilities—"
"Came from Voldemort's soul in me?"
James winced. "Well, yes."
And to think that Harry used to like his ability to talk to snakes, thought it useful, special.
"Lily's sacrifice was also the reason why your soul and Voldemort's stayed separate," James said. "It kept a barrier between them, of sorts. After tonight, it would have started breaking down, but even then it would take years for your soul and Voldemort's to meld into one."
"Why would it start breaking down?" Harry asked. "Why after tonight? Because of the killing curse?" "No," Lily said, and for the first time anger flashed in her bright green eyes. "Because Voldemort took your blood."
Your blood carries the protection, James said, resting a hand on Lily's arm. Now it flows in Voldemort's veins. Your blood in his veins, his soul in your body. You see how complicated this is getting. Yes, Harry said hoarsely. Are we going to become the same person or something? Share minds? I don't know. How on earth am I supposed to defeat him if we're getting more and more the same? Shh, Lily said. She wrapped an arm around Harry and kissed his temple. The hideous baby balanced gently on her knee. No, you're never going to become the same person. Of course not. You might have shared minds, though, in a way, James noted. You had a link between you, the curse scar. You have received a glimpse into Voldemort's mind through it, I believe. Harry thought of his summer nightmare and shuddered. Voldemort's fragment of soul inside you was reaching out to Voldemort. For the same reason your scar hurt next to him. All right, Harry said, although nothing was all right. But what about now? I mean, I'm here, and this is... He gestured at the shriveled baby in his mother's arms. And here is where it becomes even more complicated, James nodded, for many reasons. One of them being that while you served as a sort of tether to life for Voldemort, carrying a piece of his soul in you, he is the same for you now, because he took your blood. Wait, Harry begged, holding up a hand. I don't understand. The prophecy says, neither can live while the other survives, and now it seems that neither can die? Well, death is the other side of life, James said pragmatically. Your life and death are tied to Voldemort through the prophecy. Harry didn't like the sound of that. So, my blood in Voldemort's veins is keeping me alive? There are also 2 souls in you that could die, James added. Yours and Voldemort's own, of which he has no idea. And it's his curse that tried to kill you, Lily said darkly. Him killing his own soul. Well, it resulted in a bit of a loop, especially with your blood and my protection mixed in. Harry's head was starting to hurt. That is still keeping it relatively simple, Lily sighed. There's also the fact that you were under the invisibility cloak when you died. Harry raised his eyebrows. So what, death couldn't see me? That's right, James said, in all seriousness. Death couldn't see you. Harry stared. It's a very old legend, Lily informed him, and the cloak is a very old artifact. It has been passed down through James's family for generations, supposedly originating with its creator, Ignotus Peverell. Yes, heard of him, Harry muttered. According to the legend, Ignotus hid from Death under his cloak, and Death could not find him, Lily said. He only died when he took off the cloak and surrendered willingly. Now, it's probably half myth, and I'm sure nobody has yet used the cloak for surviving the killing curse. But you're my son, and therefore special, James beamed. The impact with the curse and the magics interwoven there have probably destroyed the cloak, though. James shrugged. A worthy cause. Right, Harry said. He thought of the times he'd sneaked around Hogwarts with the cloak, safe under his protection. He thought of hiding under it tonight, of clutching it over himself as the last line of defense against Voldemort. And it's midsummer, James continued in the meanwhile. Summer solstice, a very powerful day. There is a reason why Voldemort had chosen it to come back, because his ritual was not foolproof either. So, this is why I'm still alive, Harry concluded, although it sounded more like a question. All these things, and I'm not dead. Yes, Lily's smile radiated warmth. Yes, and you could go back to life. More than that, you would be whole now. Voldemort's soul, she looked down at the bundle in her arms. It would stay. You would be free of it. I wouldn't be able to speak Parseltongue anymore, Harry said, not sure how he meant it, as a good thing or a bad thing. It came out flat. You wouldn't, James agreed. You would have no more visions either, because the connection would be severed. So, I go back, Harry said, not letting these details distract him. Whole, without Voldemort's soul in me this time, and live on. Yes, his parents were nodding encouragingly. Or else I could stay here. James's expression turned wary as he said, Yes. With you. Harry, Lily said, eyes brimming with sadness. Please don't. Harry looked at his dad. James ran a hand through his hair. Kid, we're not ready to have you die. Not any more than you were before you got here. It's better that way. But if I stayed, I'd be here. With you. Yes, but that's all you would ever be. Harry looked at his hands, clasped in his lap. It was tempting to imagine the perfect life he would lead here, something that he would never have back in reality, because the two people it centered around were dead. But if he stayed, knowing he could go back, the action would reek strongly of suicide. But his parents were here, and he could stay with them. But his dad was right. That was all he would ever be. Here. This here was not life. His life would stop. It would end, and he'd have this instead. But I'd be going back to the prophecy, Harry said, swallowing hard. I'd be going back to Voldemort, and to the prophecy, and to having been killed. Yes, Lily whispered, drawing him into her shoulder. Yes, sweetheart, it's going to be difficult. Harry looked around the open space they were at, which had finally solidified into what Harry recognized as the King's Cross station. You're going to get on a train, he said, suddenly certain. Yes. And I have to leave. Even quieter now. Yes. How... Voldemort is there. How could I get away? Wouldn't I just die again? The Triwizard Cup is a portkey, Lily said urgently, looking into Harry's eyes. It's a portkey that's charmed both ways. Both? Crouch subverted the portkey to bring you away, James explained. The cup was supposed to be one, from the maze to the audience. He probably saw no need to remove that, since it was easier to just tweak the portkey instead of creating a new one. Yeah, okay, Harry said, dazed. It seemed to him that everything sped up a little. The white mist stopped twirling, the scene before him was becoming more vague, and he heard the distinct whistle of the train. It's ending, isn't it? He asked, looking between his parents. I have to go, don't I? They stood up. Lily put the bundle from her arms down onto the bench and turned to face Harry, her brilliant eyes shining with tears. And something else. Was it pride? Harry, she said, taking his hand in hers. Whatever happens from now on, whatever happened in the past. Her hand squeezed Harry's, then flew up to smooth his fringe away from his forehead, to touch his cheek. Her quick caresses were feather-soft, soothing. Just never doubt that we love you. I wish we could have been there for you all these years, when Petunia... Lily swept a tear off her cheek, angrily, and then Harry found himself enveloped in her arms. And he hugged her back. Maybe if he could just wish hard enough, she would stay forever. James's hand landed on his shoulder, and Harry looked up into his eyes. The prophecy, this is not where we want you to go back, James said, expression solemn. You didn't ask to be named in the prophecy to save the world, and I don't care what anyone says. Nobody can expect you to. If you do, it's your choice. I want you to go back, because you have a chance to live. Live for yourself, not for some prophecy. Do you understand? Harry nodded, though he understood only that the scene was fading, that his time here was running out, and that he was about to lose his parents, all over again, and this time it would be by his own choice. For a moment he wanted to scream for it all to stop, to change his mind, to grasp at the fleeting images of a future that would never come to pass. But he was slipping, and the world was blurring, and his parents were waving, and it was already too late. Harry came to with his body sprawled on the ground, face pressed to hard soil. Its smell assaulted his nose as his lungs took a deep breath. Over the thunderous beating of his heart, he heard a rustle of cloaks in the distance, hushed exclamations exchanged between several people. "Move away, Everett! Let me help our lord! You can't tell me what to do, Crouch!" Harry swallowed, then opened his eyes. He was alive. He was alive, and his only chance to continue living was in reaching the Triwizard Cup that lay a long way away somewhere. Raising his head slightly, Harry saw Death Eaters crowded around the prone body of the Dark Lord. Odd. It seemed as if he too had fallen when the curse hit Harry. Voldemort was getting up now, and there was no time to waste. "Accio Cup!" Harry whispered, fingers tense around his wand. Then he aimed it at the Death Eaters. "Fulman!" He shut his eyes against the blinding flash of light as Death Eaters screamed obscenities. He knew he got them. However, now they also knew. "He's alive!" It was impossible to mistake the honest incredulity, horror, and almost awe in that cry. Harry opened his eyes to see Death Eaters looking around blindly, trying to spot him. Voldemort, though, he hadn't been caught by the charm, but he seemed momentarily frozen by the shock of seeing Harry alive, though his face reflected nothing. Then he sent a spell fizzling towards Harry, and Harry rolled out of the way and lunged for the cup that was sailing towards him in the air, swerving closer. Voldemort fired a spell at the cup now, probably guessing Harry's intent, but Harry's frantic "Protego!" had enough power behind it to block the spell before it hit, and then it didn't matter any longer. Harry's hand closed on the cup. He clutched it, trying to stave off nausea as the portkey whirled him back to Hogwarts. Or at least he hoped he'd be going to Hogwarts, that his parents were right. His parents. He slammed into solid ground, disoriented, and there were screams from all sides, shouting his name and the news of his return. Looking up, Harry saw Quidditch stands, redressed for the third task, people's worried faces all blurring into one large blob, and the castle looming in the distance. He was definitely at Hogwarts. It was as if his body had been waiting just for that final confirmation to give out. Suddenly he felt very weak and very tired, like his bones weighed too much for him to carry. The Triwizard Cup dropped from his unfeeling fingers. "Harry, my boy," a familiar voice said from beside him. "I cannot express how glad we all are to see you in good health." Harry stifled a hysterical laugh. "In good health? Is that what they called it these days? You were in good health if you'd managed to die?" "Voldemort," he rasped. "Voldemort. He's back. I saw him." Dumbledore seemed grim, but not surprised. "Then it is as we feared," he said. "Are you seriously injured, Harry? I see a wound on your arm. Do you think you can walk?" "I think so." Dumbledore helped Harry up. Harry saw a cordon of Aurors closing off the arena. closing off the area. Briefly he glimpsed Cedric trying to get through and being denied access. On the other hand, Cornelius Fudge, or someone who looked very much like him, was approaching Harry and Dumbledore. "Now, see here, what do we have? Potter, what are you—" "Cornelius," Dumbledore interrupted smoothly, "if you could continue your admirable handling of the situation here, I will question young Harry on tonight's events and speak to you as soon as possible. In half an hour, perhaps? I am afraid the matters are most urgent." Yes, but— Very well." The minister seemed no more certain what to do than the rest of the people around them, but he drew himself up and marched off, shouting orders at the Aurors. "I want to go to the hospital wing," Harry said bluntly, as Dumbledore led him towards the castle. Surely he couldn't be expected to deal with any more shit tonight. "The hospital wing is indeed our destination," Dumbledore said. "However, it is imperative that I hear the story of what occurred tonight in order to begin marshalling our defences against it, as I am sure you realize." Time seemed to be playing tricks on Harry. They had only just got through the crowd of onlookers out on the pitch, but he was already stumbling over the castle stairs.
I've told you all that was important, Harry forced out, trying to summon anger through the haze of his exhaustion. Anger was good. If he was angry, he wouldn't let himself go, and shatter in 1,000 pieces right here in the entrance hall. Voldemort is back. What else is there? Aren't you going to do something about it? Tell the minister, alert the press? All in good time, Harry, Dumbledore promised. For now, I must find out the manner in which tonight's events occurred, or else I shall remain uncertain as to the best course of action. The infirmary doors opened without prompting before Harry and Dumbledore. The nurse came out to meet them. Mr. Potter! Her eyes widened at the sight of him. What have you been doing to yourself? Oh my, the headmaster! What can I... We will require a quarter of an hour, Poppy, Dumbledore said, inclining his head politely. After that, Mr. Potter is yours to treat. The boy needs immediate medical attention, Madame Pomfrey insisted, but wilted under the force of Dumbledore's gaze. Oh, very well. A quarter of an hour, and not a moment longer. I don't care what earth-shattering matters are being discussed. She retreated huffing into the room at the back of the infirmary. Harry sat gingerly at one of the hospital beds. They were pristine white, and he was covered in blood, sweat, and dirt, and he had the absurd thought that Aunt Petunia would have a fit. And yet thinking of his aunt made him recall his parents, and he needed to move on from that thought before the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. Dumbledore seated himself on the bed opposite Harry's. Dear boy, I understand that this is a very trying time for you, but I really must ask, where did Barty Crouch's portkey take you? To a graveyard, Harry began automatically, but then his mind caught up with the words. He hadn't even mentioned Crouch yet. Wait, how do you... Alester finally broke through the Imperius tonight at about the same time when young Diggory shot up Red Sparks, Dumbledore related somberly. Alester informed us of Crouch's plan. You see, Crouch escaped Hogwarts earlier today and left real Alester in his place. Professor Moody had to be present at the task, lest I grew suspicious. Crouch's attention must have wavered during the course of tonight, so Alester broke the Imperius and told us of the plan. Cedric Diggory confirmed that you had indeed been taken somewhere by the cup. To a graveyard, Harry repeated, filling in the pause. He spoke fast, doing his best not to listen to the words coming out of his mouth. It took me to some graveyard, and Voldemort was there, and so was Crouch, and then there was the ceremony with blood of the enemy and bone of the father, and he cut off his own hand, and he was happy about it, and then Voldemort was alive, and Death Eaters arrived, and he told the story, and then we duelled. You did? Dumbledore asked, leaning forward. Not really. He killed me. The headmaster went still, eyes alert on Harry. And yet you seem perfectly alive, my boy, he said at length. That would be because I am, Harry retorted, tenuous hold on his temper slipping. For a lot of reasons, and my cloak is totally wrecked now, but you know what? I found out a lot of things that you haven't told me, sir, and if you really want to talk to me, instead of letting me get fixed up, you can tell me why you've kept silent about things that I know you knew. Somewhere in the distant part of his mind he couldn't believe he was talking to the man like that, but at the same time, what could Dumbledore really do? He wouldn't kill the boy who lived, and Harry had already died once tonight anyway. Besides, it was either this or flying into outright hysteria. It is true that I have kept some information from you, Harry, Dumbledore said. However, please believe me when I say that everything I have done with your benefit in mind. Because me facing Voldemort, while unaware of the prophecy or of his soul fragment inside me, was really great, Harry snarled. Thanks so much. He thought dimly through his rage that he'd managed to surprise Dumbledore again. The man's face went blank for an instant, before the earnest expression returned. Rest assured, Harry, that you and I will discuss my decisions and the reasoning behind them at a later date.
This conversation is too lengthy and important for us to have in a hurry, and I'm afraid the fine Madame Pomfrey will evict me from her domain in very near future," Dumbledore said with a smile. Harry did not appreciate the attempt at lightening the atmosphere. He continued glaring at Dumbledore stonily. Dumbledore sighed. "There are a few more questions I must ask about tonight's events," he said. "Those of immediate importance. Please do not think that I disregard your other concerns, but the information you can provide now might save lives." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Do you know the identities of any Death Eaters present at the graveyard? Could you tell me in greater detail what Voldemort said to them? And it might seem intrusive to you, but I must know, exactly how did your confrontation with Voldemort unfold?" And Dumbledore stood firm and looked into Harry's eyes as if scanning him with an X-ray machine, and Harry was too damn tired and incoherent and incapable of evading Dumbledore's verbal traps right now. He hated to tell Dumbledore about the meeting with his parents, but in the end it proved necessary, because it was apparently a big deal whether or not Voldemort knew the full prophecy, and whether or not he was aware of his soul fragment inside Harry. Harry still reduced the meeting to a few bare facts. Parents, soul fragment, prophecy. But by the end he felt like he'd physically assault Dumbledore if the man asked a single question more. When Dumbledore finally left, Harry remained sitting on the hospital bed, completely wrung out. "Mr. Potter!" Madame Pomfrey cried, bustling back into the room. "At last!" She did a scan of his injuries and gasped when the full extent of the damage showed up. The killing curse, in particular, left a new scar on Harry's chest that the matron had blatantly no idea what to do with. She muttered to herself in frustration about the dangers that students were being exposed to as she applied salves and healing spells to Harry's wounds. "Your friends wish to see you, but I absolutely forbid it," she told him in a voice that clearly disapproved of friends in general. "You are in no fit state to be receiving visitors. Drink this." She handed him a potion. "Now go to sleep, and give your body a chance to recover." Harry complied, only too ready to say goodbye to reality and fall into a slumber. Perhaps then he could forget for a while that he had actually died tonight, that Voldemort was back, and that everything would be different now, forever. Harry was looking out of the infirmary window. He watched the play of sun and shadow on the leaves of a tree nearby. If he opened the window and extended a hand, he'd be able to touch those leaves, which were sometimes a dark forest green, sometimes golden in the light, and if the sun shone just so, the leaves were an impossible shade of emerald. There were things Harry could compare that colour to, but didn't, because that would just stir up the ghosts he was trying to put to rest. In that regard, his forced confinement to the hospital wing was a blessing. Harry wasn't ready to go out and meet the school, the press, the ministry, without knowing what he thought about anything. There were decisions to be made and conclusions to be drawn, and dice... well, never mind that. The die had already been cast, although Harry's hand had been forced there somewhat. Certain things had been taken out of his hands before he was even born, but others he could still determine for himself. He'd chosen, back at the ephemeral King's Cross Station, to have a future. He'd always just lived before. He'd taken his being alive for granted and just lived without thinking too much of the future or inquiring too deeply about the past. He now knew it had been a mistake. He'd let others determine what he knew of his past, and his past was hiding things that dictated his future. Blaming Dumbledore for that was as tempting as it was impossible. Dumbledore had not told Harry anything, but Harry had never asked either. In a similar vein, Voldemort had made it his goal to kill Harry, but the continuation of their struggle would be just as much Harry's doing, because Harry had chosen to come back, at the urging of his parents, yes,
but he'd chosen to return in full awareness of what he would be facing. Voldemort was a part of the future Harry had chosen to face. He and Voldemort were inextricably linked. Harry had known this, instinctively, for a long time. Ever since second year, he'd felt delicate threads of destiny connecting himself and Tom Riddle. The prophecy explained a lot, but changed nothing. Righteous rage or thirst for revenge were far from Harry's mind as he looked into his future. Instead, he was filled with the cold certainty that he would have to fight Voldemort. Sooner or later, in one form or another, it would inevitably happen. Harry would not be free to live his life until he cut Voldemort out of existence, until their lives and deaths stopped revolving around each other, until he was unencumbered by prophetic bonds. He didn't want to die again. Lying awake in the early hours of next morning, before the sun rose and the sky was still the dull grey colour of unwashed linen, Harry promised to himself that Voldemort would be the one dying the next time. "Merlin, Harry, I'm so sorry," were Cedric's first words. Incidentally, Cedric was also Harry's first visitor the next day. Perhaps Harry should not have been so surprised to see him, considering that he did vaguely recall seeing Cedric, ashen-faced and desperate, when he'd returned from the graveyard that night. "What are you sorry for?" Harry asked cautiously. "For the cup. I basically made you take it, and then you disappeared for an hour, and then you looked half dead and all bloody. I'm sorry too," Harry said, "for the way I ended up taking it. But it's not your fault that I took it." Cedric shook his head and sat down next to Harry's bed. "Where did the portkey you to?" he asked quietly. And Harry had to decide here whether he wanted to tell his friends the truth, because he really didn't want to talk about it ever again. But it wasn't the kind of news he could keep to himself. His friends needed to know. The world needed to know. This was beyond Harry's sensitivities. Dumbledore was right. This could save lives. "Voldemort," he said in the end, after what felt like an eternity of gazing at the white sheets on his bed. "It took me to Voldemort." He gave Cedric a brief summary of what had happened, already imagining the way he'd have to repeat it time and time again, to all his friends and then maybe to some strangers. He skipped the whole meeting with his parents, as well as the information revealed therein. He was not yet ready to confess to the prophecy, or to having served as a vessel to Voldemort's soul fragment. He related his story without glancing at Cedric once, afraid to see disbelief written on his face. Or rejection, like that night. "Cheating is not what I expected you to do." There was silence after he'd finished. Then Cedric said, in a strangled whisper, "It could have been either one of us." And Harry started, because that had not occurred to him before. Because, despite however traumatizing the experience had been, Harry could see the logic of Voldemort choosing him for use in this particular ritual. Harry Potter had been Voldemort's downfall. Well, he'd be his resurrection too. What if Cedric had won that duel, as he should have? Voldemort might have taken Cedric's blood, but then Cedric would die, Harry's mind supplied. Voldemort would probably not have given Cedric back his wand, and there was no prophecy, no soul fragments, and no blood protection between Cedric and Voldemort. Cedric would have been dead by that killing curse, irreversibly, and his corpse would have stayed to rot next to the grave of Tom Riddle Sr. Harry shuddered, and it was sick to even consider it, but maybe it had to be Harry there at that graveyard in the end. On a more educational note, Cedric filled Harry in on what had taken place while he'd been gone. As soon as Harry had disappeared, Cedric had sent up red sparks. Everyone had been expecting Harry to appear in front of the crowd, because the cup was meant to be a portkey. Minutes had passed. Harry had failed to show. Then Mad-Eye Moody had gone into convulsions and started spouting really strange things, and Cedric might have panicked a little bit because his memories weren't very clear, but he did remember Fred Weasley clocking him in the face with the question of what he'd done to Harry. There had been a general commotion when it had become obvious that something had gone dreadfully wrong with the task. Victor Krumm came out from under the Imperius, Fleur de la Cour suffered the after-effects of a cruciatus, and Aurors had been called onto the scene. "And what are people saying now?" Harry inquired cautiously. Cedric shrugged. "They're speculating, but there's been no official explanation of anything," he said. "There was a small article in the Prophet about a disturbance at the tournament. The Ministry's keeping mum. Dumbledore's made no announcement. Karkaroff is gone. Nobody explains that either. Everyone gets it that something huge has happened, but the lack of information is setting people on edge." "Karkaroff is gone?" Harry repeated. "Running from Voldemort, judging by what you said," Cedric nodded. "Victor looks like he'll kill the next person who asks him a question. Fleur hasn't been seen." "And what about you? Aren't people asking you questions?" Cedric buried his face in his hands with a groan. "Don't remind me. I didn't even know what to say, because up until now I only knew that you disappeared. Do you—" He raised his eyes. "Do you want me to tell others about you-know-who and all?" Harry sighed. "Yeah, just don't go into the details," he said. "They need to know, especially if nobody else is telling them anything." "I've spoken to my dad," Cedric said. "It seems that he's been under some pressure to keep me quiet about what I've seen. He's having none of it, of course, but I think the Ministry might want to hush things up." Harry frowned. "Great! I guess there's only that much the Ministry can hush up, though," he mused. "I mean, if everyone knew things went wrong, and Aurors were called, and the champions gave their evidence." "Yeah, and foreign newspapers are writing about it," Cedric said. "So we'll see what happens. I'll spread the word anyway." Harry's prediction about having to tell the story many times came true. Of course, all his friends poured into the infirmary to visit him, each worried and wishing to know what on earth had happened. Neville had been wide-eyed and pale, Terry and Anthony serious, Hermione openly sympathetic. The twins tried for nonchalance. Luna did a better impression of it, seemingly without trying, except that her hands shook visibly. The first time Harry was asked about Sirius Black's presence among the Death Eaters, he didn't know what they were talking about. "What? No, Sirius Black is innocent. He's never been a Death Eater. He killed the man really responsible for betraying my parents and escaped from Britain. I don't know where he is, but he has nothing to do with this." And everyone stared at him in amazement, but Harry only shrugged it off. His anger at Sirius Black seemed distant and inconsequential now. In the light of recent events, he couldn't recall why it was supposed to be a big deal. Harry showed up and nearly crushed Harry's ribs in a hug. Padma came too, and was uncharacteristically solemn as she listened. She seemed to be evaluating everything, weighing Harry's story, and her dark eyes were observant as she took in the briefest flashes of emotion on Harry's face. She surprised Harry by saying quietly, "This changes everything, doesn't it? You're going to need as many people on your side as you can have." And then, with a hint of her usual fickleness, "Good thing I'm so charming. I'll bring lots of converts." In the end, Harry learned most from the way Blaise and Millie treated him. They were watchful and quietly supportive, careful not to say too much, and their cautious attitude told Harry volumes about the mood in Slytherin. Incidentally, all of Harry's non-Slytherin friends warned him against returning to that pit of snakes. After all, Slytherin was widely associated with Death Eater connections. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Harry would be in danger there. Terry suggested a resorting in a joking tone, but his eyes betrayed his seriousness. "I'm a Slytherin too," Harry answered to all such claims. "I won't be scared away from my own house. They'll just have to deal with it." And yet, he wasn't all that sure of himself when he opened the door and stepped into the Slytherin common room. There was an instant hush,
The moment he walked in, conversations died down and people turned to stare. Before Harry had managed to take a few steps towards his usual seat, a solid wall of students materialized in front of him, blocking his way and holding him in a semicircle. Harry glanced around and saw Malfoy's gleeful face, Bletchley's frown, and the inscrutable expressions of Blaise and Millicent. They did not rush forward to defend him. They stayed there with the group, waiting for him to prove himself, or else sink. They weren't on his ship unless they knew for sure it would weather the first serious storm. Well, he'd been expecting something like this. Bring it on, then. Harry raised his chin defiantly, leaned back against the wall, and smiled with aplomb he did not feel. So, Potter, care to tell us what happened during the third task? Montague threw the first question. Perhaps he'd been appointed as the spokesman. Perhaps he was just more impatient than the others. Odd that you should ask, Harry said. As a matter of fact, Voldemort and I had a little chat. I suppose some of you, a pointed glance at Malfoy, already know this from your parents. Bullshit! Someone shouted. A ripple of angry mutters went through the crowd. Your story is bullshit, declared a seventh year Harry vaguely knew by sight. If you'd met the Dark Lord, you wouldn't still be alive. People were nodding in agreement. Harry gathered his mental focus to stay impassive through the next bit. What made you think he wanted to kill me? Naturally, a general outcry followed. Of course he'd want to kill you. You're the boy who lived. You wouldn't stand a chance. Yes, I'm the boy who lived, Harry asserted, once the shouts had quieted down a bit. I'm special, aren't I? Voldemort knows this better than anyone. How can you be sure? And here he made a dramatic pause. That Voldemort wouldn't want me to join him. That's wrong! Crabbe was shaking his head in bewilderment. My father said the Dark Lord killed you and... Vince! Malfoy hissed in warning, but it was too late, and made worse by Goyle's supportive, Yeah, and you didn't die! The crowd of Slytherins erupted in murmurs. Suddenly Harry's story was confirmed by an unexpected source. Wait, so you mean you know who is actually back? Potter is making it all up, Malfoy insisted, but the cat was out of the bag now. Was it supposed to be a secret? Goyle wondered loudly. I thought we were happy that the Dark Lord is back, Crabbe agreed. No, you morons, we're meant to be sneaky about it, Nott snarled, furious. Harry welcomed the pandemonium that ensued. He had a few moments to sigh in relief and compose himself again. Saying those words, claiming that he had Voldemort's favour, left a foul taste in his mouth. He had been hoping that someone would contradict him. He'd actually thought it'd be Malfoy, but the blonde was apparently smarter than he appeared. Harry didn't quite know where he'd have taken his charade had the plan flopped. He just knew that he had to fight for influence in Slytherin all over again, and that it'd be pretty damn hard to do with Death Eater's children rising in power. The crowd was no longer blocking Harry's way in a neat semicircle. People were milling about and chattering anxiously, so Harry could, if he wanted, make his way through. However, that was not how he needed this to happen. He wouldn't sneak around unnoticed. He had to show that he had the right to walk with the rest of them. "How did you escape, Potter, if you know who was really there?" someone shouted. "They're saying you survived the killing curse again." "Is it true that you know who killed you and you didn't die?" This was such a circus, and Harry was walking the fucking tightrope. He braced himself for the next act. He waited until most of the noise had died down and people turned towards him, eager to hear him answer those questions. Harry raised his head high, stepped forward, and spread his arms in affected guilelessness. "How did I survive? Well, that's for me to know and for you to find out. But hey, I've told you, haven't I? I'm special." He cocked his head to the side and smirked. It kind of felt like the smirk could fall off his face any second, like a physical mark, but he hoped the glue would hold for a while longer. Losing his cool now would mean throwing himself to the sharks, If he managed to hold it, though, he might still count a victory here.
"You are so full of shit, Potter," Bletchley said, and it came out a little awed, like Bletchley was trying to mentally encompass just how full of it Harry was, but couldn't put his audacity into words. "Whatever you say, Miles." Harry was pretty sure the worst was over now. The crowd was too divided to lynch him, and he knew his performance had impressed some people. "And you," he rounded on some unfortunate second years, "are standing in my way. So do me a favour and get lost." The kids had clearly not expected the force of an angry Harry Potter to be unleashed on them. They scrambled out of his way, wide-eyed, and Harry proceeded calmly to his couch by the fire. The upholstery snakes seemed to sense his agitation. They slithered towards him and hissed. Not that Harry could understand what they were saying. Thank fuck they hadn't turned on him now that he'd lost the ability to speak Parseltongue. He'd completely forgotten to worry about that. Millie and Blaise came up to Harry then. It was safe now, wasn't it? He'd fought for his place under the sun and won himself a spot, so now they could join him. "Hey, Harry," Blaise said, flopping down on the couch. No matter how relaxed he tried to seem, his unease was palpable, and the same could be said of Millie. Harry could play with that. "Buddies again now, are we?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks for the help, by the way." "You wouldn't be worth much if you needed our help," Millie said coolly. "That so?" Harry was almost interested to hear this now. Blaise was looking between Harry and Millie in mild alarm. "This is your war to fight, Potter," Millicent snapped. "I won't be backing the wrong side. If you can't take on a bunch of kids—" "That even makes sense in a twisted kind of way," Harry shrugged. "But what if I need a break sometimes?" "Then go and hug a Hufflepuff." Harry snorted. "Fine then. Tough love, I get it. Just don't go expecting roses for next Valentine's." And yet, by openly coming up to him now, Blaise and Millie had thrown their lot in with him. Their actions had sent a clear message to everyone in the common room. Considering to whom some eyes and ears here would be reporting, it was a pretty bold statement indeed. "Harry, do come in. I dare say I'm relieved to see you recovered from your recent ordeal." Dumbledore was sitting behind his desk and smiling benevolently. His phoenix dozed on a perch next to the window. Portraits of former headmasters pretended to snooze, but Harry could see quite a few of them taking an interested peek at him. "Please sit down." Dumbledore gestured at a chintz chair. Harry complied, feeling somewhat off balance. He couldn't help remembering that, the last time they'd talked, he'd shouted his head off at Dumbledore instead of behaving like a civilized human being, mitigating factors notwithstanding. "Tea?" "No, thank you, sir. What did you want to talk to me about?" Dumbledore took a sweet from a bowl by his elbow. His bright blue eyes seemed to be carefully cataloguing Harry's appearance. "I believe I have promised to have an honest discussion with you, Harry," the headmaster said. At Harry's nod, he continued. "You charged me with concealing information from you. I give you my word, Harry, the only reason why I had not informed you of the prophecy was because I did not wish to burden you with it. You were so young." "I would have preferred to know," Harry said firmly. Dumbledore shook his head. "Perhaps I should have told you, but I did not wish to add to your worries," he said. "I looked at you as a first year struggling to make a life for yourself in Slytherin, and thought that surely it was not essential for you to know of the prophecy yet. The following year I had the perfect opportunity to tell you. You were in my office, the conversation could easily turn to Voldemort, but again I hesitated. You were exhausted. You were scarred. You had just battled a deadly creature and emerged victorious. What good would it do to trouble you with that knowledge?" Harry remembered his self-doubt after the trip to the Chamber of Secrets, his worries and fears. If he had discovered then that there was a prophecy connecting him and the Dark Lord, well, perhaps he would have breathed easier for knowing there was a reason, however twisted, for the numerous similarities between himself and Tom Riddle. Not to mention the fragment of Voldemort's soul inside me. You knew about it, Harry accused.
Dumbledore sighed. "I merely suspected," he said. "I could not know. But I suspected that you and Voldemort might be connected more deeply than anybody understood. You possessed a most curious scar, the aura of which I had my suspicions. I had no proof, however. I chose not to distress you with my speculations." "Was it really your place to choose for me? It's my life. I should have known what to expect. I should not have been walking into Voldemort's trap blind—" Dumbledore inclined his head. "You are right in that I have, perhaps, delayed telling you for too long. I admit I could not stand to burden you with this responsibility earlier than was absolutely necessary." Harry frowned. It was true that he'd been happier not knowing, but ignoring the problem would not make it go away. Still, if he'd been in Dumbledore's place, would he have told himself? "I do understand," he said quietly. "But, Professor, please stop withholding information from me from now on. I would rather know the truth, whatever it is." "I shall endeavour to do my best in that regard," Dumbledore smiled, and with a sinking heart Harry saw in his expression that it would not end here. Dumbledore would keep hiding things, was still hiding things, and he would not part with the information until he deemed it appropriate. Harry clenched his jaw in anger. He wasn't asking for secrets that didn't concern him. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity, but the war did concern him. Anything to do with Voldemort concerned him, and God help Dumbledore if he was still hiding something about Harry personally. He'd done enough stumbling around in the dark already. "I imagine you have questions, Harry," Dumbledore said, changing the subject. "You have not asked about the prophecy." Harry had had plenty of time to consider the prophecy and its various meanings while he'd stayed in the infirmary alone with his thoughts. The one thing that really made him wonder was, "It says I have a power the Dark Lord knows not." That at least was good news. Over the last few days Harry had tried to imagine all kinds of great powers he might possess, even though none manifested. Dumbledore seemed to be actually pleased by the question. "And this power has already let you survive Voldemort's attack twice," he said. "Your parents told you of Lily's sacrifice, I believe." "Yes," Harry muttered. "Then you know that your mother's willing sacrifice created a shield of love that made the killing curse rebound off you. Her sacrifice outlasted that night. The wards on your house at Privet Drive are powered by her love and maintained by the presence of her blood relative, your aunt." Harry blinked. So this was why he stayed with the Dursleys. He'd wondered. Still, "I'm sorry, sir, but how does this relate to the power the Dark Lord knows not?" "Unlike Lord Voldemort, Harry, you possess the ability to love." Harry waited. When no elaboration was forthcoming, he ventured, "Sir, you believe that the power the Dark Lord knows not is love?" "Yes, Harry," Dumbledore nodded, as if happy that Harry had caught on so quickly. Harry stared. "Love," he repeated, just to make sure. "What will win us this war, my ultimate weapon? Love." "Yes." "I'm sorry, Professor, but did you defeat Grindelwald with the power of love too?" Oddly, Dumbledore went a little pale at that. However, he overcame the weakness quickly, and in the next moment was already smiling at Harry in his usual genial way. "That's a tale for another time, Harry. For now, I would like to warn you against taking the power of love too lightly. You, whose entire existence is sustained by it, must know of the power love holds. Voldemort, who neither understands nor values love, has been thwarted twice by it. It is your greatest asset, Harry." "If you say so, Professor," Harry said dubiously. "But shouldn't I get some sort of training, now that Voldemort is back, and he will want to kill me?" "It is not your dueling skills that will defeat Voldemort," Dumbledore said firmly, "but the strength of your whole, pure soul against his." And Dumbledore seemed really convinced of this, that love was the only possible answer. In a roundabout, gentle fashion, he told Harry that it was unrealistic to expect the prophesied saviour to become Voldemort's equal in skill and power quickly enough. Voldemort had decades of experience on Harry, and they could hardly wait for Harry to catch up. The world would be doomed in the meanwhile. No, Harry's true might and the world's hope apparently lay in his ability to love, in the purity of his spirit and the strength of his soul. Except that Harry couldn't help thinking that Dumbledore knew him very little if he considered him to be a loving, kind-hearted, noble-spirited individual. Harry walked out of Dumbledore's office, secure in the belief that he couldn't afford to rely on anyone entirely. Then again, he hadn't been planning to. The conversation with Dumbledore had been disappointing, but Harry would be foolish to make an enemy out of the man. Dumbledore had, after all, defeated the Dark Lord in his time, played a significant part in the war against Voldemort, and was an immensely powerful wizard besides. Harry could not hope to rush into battle at 14 and expect Voldemort to fall defeated. Determination alone was not enough. Harry needed knowledge and experience and support. He'd take it where he could get it. Following anyone blindly, on the other hand, was definitely not on his agenda. "Potter, a word if you don't mind." Harry turned around warily. There, a few feet away from him in the hallway, stood Mad-Eye Moody. Last time Harry had seen Moody, his face had been morphing into that of Barty Crouch Jr. It did not evoke pleasant memories. "Professor?" Moody snorted. "I've never been your professor, lad. Haven't taught a day in this school. But you know all about it, don't you?" Now Harry was looking closer. He saw that Moody's magical eye did not seem to be magical at all. It was a static glass prosthetic. Moody must have noticed Harry's stare, because he said, "Crouch buggered off with my eye, and they still haven't got a replacement ready for me. Tricky things to make, these magical eyes. The leg, that's easy. They fixed it right up while I stayed at St. Mungo's." "Right," Harry said. "Don't trust me worth damn, do you?" Moody gave a mirthless laugh. "I'm not blaming you, Potter. It's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." Moody put one hand in a pocket and extracted a piece of parchment that was achingly familiar to Harry. Harry's eyes widened. "Thought you'd recognize it," Moody said. "Here, I'm leaving it. I'm leaving, so I've no use for it. You might as well have it back." Harry walked over and took the Marauder's map into his hands, barely able to believe what was happening. "Why do you have it, sir? I thought that Crouch—" "Crouch needed it to escape Hogwarts before the third task," Moody interrupted. "He needed to get to the graveyard ahead of time, so he had me lead him out with the map in hand, and then I used the map to return to my quarters without anyone seeing. All under the Imperius, of course." Moody grimaced. "Thank you for returning it to me, sir," Harry said. He'd thought the map, just like the invisibility cloak, irretrievably lost. "That's not quite all," Moody said, when Harry was turning to leave. "There's something that you don't know, but you should." Moody looked around to check that nobody was there, but he needn't have bothered. The castle was almost empty, with everyone enjoying the warm day outside. "You didn't trust Crouch," Moody said, his voice low. "You didn't give him this map voluntarily." "I'm sorry?" "You've been obliviated," Moody stated bluntly. "I don't know the particulars, because Crouch only told me that much, and that mostly through cursing at you, but you figured him out, Potter. You used this map and figured him out, but he caught you at it. You duelled, he won." Harry clenched his fists. "Is there any way for me to recover the memory?" "Not unless you want your mind broken." Harry remembered the bruises he'd sported that day, Blaze's strange acceptance of his decision to trust Moody, and his own unease at parting with the map. He felt unclean, knowing that his mind had been tampered with. He hated the thought that someone had removed his memory. He'd make that Crouch bastard pay when he got his hands on him. "If you're thinking of vengeance, give it up, lad," Moody advised suddenly, "because Barty Crouch Jr. is mine." And here Moody gave a truly feral smile that Harry returned with satisfaction. It was good to know that not everyone on this blasted good side planned to defeat their enemies with the power of love. Thankfully, there was only a week between the third task and departure from Hogwarts, and Harry had spent 3 days of that time in the hospital wing. With everything that had happened, just living day to day hadn't been so hard for him ever before. He existed in this state of constant tension, knowing that he could not afford to show weakness, not in front of the press, not in front of the teachers, not in front of the students. It was incredibly taxing to act calm and collected all the time, but Harry was sure, and he revelled in this knowledge, that most of the students he came across saw only his strength, his confidence, his, dare he say it, power. Harry Potter was, after all, the winner of the Triwizard Tournament. Nobody knew that Harry's success was the work of a Death Eater. They beheld, instead, a 14-year-old boy who defeated formidable opponents. It was no wonder people whispered, "He was the boy who lived." Of course nobody else had stood a chance. After all, Harry Potter was a legend. There had to be a reason why you-know-who had failed when he tried to kill him. And did you hear? They say you-know-who had tried to kill him again, and the killing curse hadn't worked. "How many people actually believe that, do you think?" Harry asked, staring at the lake unseeingly. "More than you imagine," Luna answered. Her hands worked at making a wreath of some purple flowers. Harry glanced at them and absently picked up a stray petal. "But I mean, why would they? After a year of Rita's bullshit, I come up with an outrageous story and can't offer any proof." Luna looked at him seriously and laid her wreath aside. "Your friend Hermione Granger has the same problem," she said. "Huh? Do you remember when you introduced us and she did not believe me about the blibbering humdingers?" Yeah, that had been an awkward conversation. "For Hermione, magic is limited to simple cause and effect," Luna explained. When Harry still didn't understand, she continued, "You have the same, though a little less. Maybe it is because you have lived among muggles. Things work differently there, I think. But magic has its own logic, you know." Harry frowned. "Which is?" "It's quite tricky, really. Magic depends on intent, mood, and confidence," Luna said. "You have to feel certain things in order to cast certain spells. You have to believe you can do it. You can't predict how things will work every time. Nobody knows the limits of magic." Okay, but what has it got to do with people believing me about Voldemort?" Luna sighed. "Wizards think differently from muggles, Harry, because their lives revolve around magic. Their idea of what should be possible and what should not is much more broad than that of muggles." Harry chose not to point out that most people's perspectives on magic weren't as all-encompassing as Luna's. "People fought a long war against you-know-who, and then one day he came across a baby and disappeared." Luna hid her wreath behind her, demonstrating Voldemort's disappearance. "Did people look for him for a long time?" "No. It might be silly to think that a baby can defeat an evil wizard, but everyone spent the very next day celebrating." She threw petals into the air. "Because they believed you-know-who to be gone." "So you are saying—" "I'm saying that belief is very important for wizards, and you, Harry, are a miracle. It's easy to believe in you, if you allow it." Harry stared at Luna, but she just smiled at him somewhat vacantly, extracted the flowers from behind her back, and started working on them again. That night, all throughout dinner and Dumbledore's announcement of Voldemort's resurrection, Harry dwelled on Luna's words. He wondered how many of those frightened, confused-looking students in the Great Hall believed Dumbledore now. How many could be swayed in the future? Rita Skeeter's article had probably shaken their faith in Harry, but then Harry had quite a few friends as well, friends who, in Padma's words, were willing to bring him converts. "There is a person I must acknowledge when I talk about Lord Voldemort's return," Dumbledore said. "I am speaking, of course, of Harry Potter."
Excited murmurs swept the great hall. Snape was the only one at the high table not to look at least vaguely excited by that opening. Instead, the man sent Harry another one of those speculative looks he'd taken to giving Harry as of late. Harry wondered how much he knew.
"Harry Potter managed to escape Lord Voldemort that night. He showed the kind of bravery few adult wizards have ever demonstrated when facing Lord Voldemort. For that, I honor him."
Dumbledore raised his goblet to Harry, and Harry fought the urge to blush or protest loudly. First of all, he didn't remember showing any bravery, and secondly, he didn't want this attention on him. He'd done nothing heroic, and whatever Harry's position at the school, Dumbledore wasn't making it better by this display. "Belief is very important for wizards, and you, Harry, are a miracle. It's easy to believe in you, if you allow it."
"Ah, damn it."
Uncomfortably aware of curious gazes from all sides, Harry made a conscious effort at relaxing, smiling confidently, and projecting the image of a true hero unfazed by fame or attention. Facing all of Slytherin had been bad enough. This, bearing the scrutiny of the whole school at once, was positively hellish. Still, it had to be done. Harry would do well to get used to the spotlight. He needed them to believe in him, after all. End of Year 4.